about all of these things. I have a slide up with a few images myself, a few company logos around, and a few images, and I'm going to explain why they're up here. So I'll start with the professional backstory. I've worked in a lot of big organizations. I spent 18 years of my career in multinationals, starting off at Deloitte as a wide-eyed graduate in Sydney, Australia, where I grew up. Moved to London as one of those many 20-year-old Aussies you've probably come across, for those who spend much time in London. Worked at Barclays, at HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Sainsbury's, and then at Chanel. I had always been kind of the exception to the rule, both in my career trajectory, but also in terms of how I kind of challenged the processes and the systems around me. It shouldn't be a surprise. I started as an auditor in kind of client-facing audit and risk work at Deloitte. So the whole point was, once I was told I was like a smiling assassin, because you go in as an external auditor, people do not want you there, by the way. I'm sure you've been on the receiving end. You have to get people to share their processes and their expertise with you, knowing that you're going to tell them the things that they're doing wrong. And then you need to get them to agree with all the things that you've said, as someone who knows their stuff not as well as they do. And you need to be collaborative in being disruptive and in some ways pushing against the status quo. And I guess for me, that was perhaps not a shock that I've then continued that spirit in the different things that I've done. I fell into data and data governance mid-career when I was at Sainsbury's after time in audit and risk. And again, this was an area that, and this is why I'm so passionate about the intersections of things. You know, here we're talking about accessibility, digital innovation, AI. Data is one of those backbones that bleeds into everything. But again, I was a bit of an exception. To move into data, I took on the first ever data role at Sainsbury's. Even though I did IT at university, I never felt like a techie person. We were just in the break, Charlie and I talking about how we have like paper journals and paper calendars. And I was not someone that saw themselves as a techie. And actually the people around me did not assume this brown lady with opinions would work in data either. I entered mid-career, which meant that I had authority and I was reporting into a board. And suddenly I was in amazing networks like this where data had conferences and roundtables because it was always changing. We always needed to learn. But I was one of the very few people who was a woman in a senior data role, let alone a woman of color. But I leaned into it because guess what? Being that challenger from those audit days, being someone who grew up as a first generation kind of Sri Lankan Tamil Australian kid in Sydney, I was always lying outside of the boxes and what people expected. And so for me, I leaned way into it. I was like, if you're going to wheel me out on a panel because you don't have any women in data, let alone women of color in data, I'm going to lean right into it. I'm going to activate. I'm going to see how do we not just challenge the barriers that held me back, but it made me super curious about what are the barriers I don't even face that I can use some of my privilege, like being an Aussie in the UK, I get a bit more leeway with my accent. People be like, she's a bit feisty. It's probably because she's Australian. I use that. But I'm painting this picture to say that when you, for whatever reason, whether it's the type of work you do, who you are, or how people perceive you, and whether spaces are default built for someone like you, we carry all of that in the work that we do. And so I wanted to give you that flavor, but a few of the images here, I've never been someone that fits firmly in a box. After 18 years of being in a corporate career, there's a couple of logos here. I started my business, True Change. There aren't many women of color, sadly, that run their own businesses, let alone at higher revenue levels. I want to change that. My skin, my story. Community is so important. When we exist in environments that don't always work for us, we need to have those places of recharge. This is one of those opportunities right now. I built a community because I didn't feel like there was a space for women of color to connect with all their intersectionality, so that actually we could talk about neurodivergence and it was a woman of color talking about it. So we could talk about disability and there was a woman of color talking about it. Because by the way, we hold all intersectionalities. So I started a community, My Skin, My Story. So I was already kind of been on a semi-safe path within the corporate system, challenging from the inside, and now I really went on the outside trying to push. Also, I was a professional, but I also danced all my life. There's an image here of me when I was 5 in Bharatanatyam costume. It's something that I rarely spoke about at work because it was like, actually, is that a professional thing to talk about? As you can see, there's another photo of me dancing pretty wildly at a wedding in Bali. My comfort in speaking to you right now, being on stage, is 100% because I danced from the age of 5. I'm 40 now. I rarely stop dancing. So why would I hide that from people? But that was, again, that conditioning. So I'm laying this groundwork to talk about, like, how do we maybe debunk imposter syndrome and break it into the separate things that it is. I've got 3 words on this slide: imposter versus difference versus exclusion. So for me, I felt like an imposter sometimes. Now, sometimes that was valid because that inner critic does pop up in our heads sometimes. And managing that inner critic is a skill. Part of that is remembering the great things we do, not just the times when we feel like we're behind. But also, how do we lean in to find like the useful element of that inner critic? I found that if you're changing jobs, going to a new company, taking on a new responsibility, actually, it's probably a good thing you feel like an imposter. It's telling you there's an opportunity for learning. Is there an action there you need to take? Do I need to go to more conferences like this because actually I'm new to accessibility? So how do we strip out the useful bit that's actionable? And then how do we quieten the damaging part of imposter syndrome? And how do we learn to spot the difference? I also think sometimes we need to flip imposter syndrome to say, you know, how fun would it be to hang out with someone over dinner who's never felt like an imposter? They probably haven't stretched themselves very much. And so actually stretching yourself, going out of your comfort zone, these are all amazing things that you should be patting yourself on the back for. And that imposter element is just part of that learning journey. Now, when is it not imposter syndrome, but maybe we mislabel it to be that? As I've mentioned in my backstory, being different is not being an imposter, but being different can often mean, at least in my experience, that the people around you or the environment around you doesn't know what to do with you, right? And so I was not typical, and I have many privileges. I have neuro privilege, I have accent privilege, I have physical ability and mobility privileges, but I was also, with all my other disadvantages according to society, I was not typical. I was the exception. Not just because, as I said, there weren't many people looking like me doing the jobs that I did. Also, it was my mix of skills. I was technical and strategic. I could get into details, but also talk big picture. People think that that isn't a thing and they don't know what to do with you. In high school, I wanted to do advanced math and advanced English. They program both at the same time because society assumes that those things don't coexist. I love getting my hands dirty with data, but I'm also a storyteller. I love the human, and I also see the power of tech and data. And I'm analytical and creative, but people never quite understood what to do with me. But it took me, and not other people telling me, that this uniqueness, which sometimes can make us feel like an imposter, but it's our difference. Maybe we're pioneers. Maybe we are breaking those boxes. But it took me a little while. I realized my superpower was the bridge building between these things that people assume are at odds with each other, whether it was the skills that I bridged together or the people that I brought together. I've been told I find hidden gems and I bring those individuals together, or the disciplines. So how do we also figure out that even if other people can't process our difference, what is that uniqueness and what is that value that we can actually exploit in a positive way in how we work. And then lastly, exclusion versus imposter. This is one I'm very passionate about. I think, from my perspective, I do a lot of work around the intersection of data and digital. How do we upskill and make sure no one's left behind? I do a bunch around leadership and career confidence. How do we democratize soft skills just like we want to democratize technical skills? And I do work around inclusion and equity. Accessibility is a part of it. Now, I have personal and professional experience in this. One thing I think we all need to debunk is that when we are operating in environments that are not built for us, and all of you know what this feels like in different ways, sometimes we are told to internalize that that's a problem with us. And I think that's a lot of what our work is to actually flip that script. What is the imposter that is about you and how we skill up and how we manage that inner critic? But what is that thing where actually it's not about you, it's about the environment? And how do we be those advocates to detect the barriers and make sure that we're not conflating the two? So I will end on this last slide, which is flipping the script. Let's be honest, all of us would love to not really deal with imposter syndrome. It takes some mental energy. But as I said, I think there's a positive element in there when we are stretching ourselves, when we're listening to the actionable part of that. But the most exhausting bit is that we so far exist in environments often where our difference isn't always valued and where there are barriers that can make us feel excluded, where we are in spaces that are not built for us. Now, ideally, what we're trying to do is dismantle those challenges, right? But that takes time. So I guess in the meantime, you might have gathered I'm a bit of an optimist. And for me, it's like, how do I flip and see the positive of this? Of course, I wish I didn't have to go with any of these things, go through these things. It can be tiring, can be exhausting. That's where community is important. But I ran a My Skin, My Story event. We had an awesome Black French woman on the panel. I'm stealing this from her. She said, when I walk into a room and no one looks like me, I know they desperately need me. So part of my journey has been owning it. How do we make sure that difference, that ability to detect barriers and exclusion, how do we become that advocate for ourselves and that advocate for other people? For me, I've kind of owned that being the only one in the room. Well, I'm going to make sure that I leave my impact and also open that door. So I'm maybe the first in that room and not the last. Being aware of bias and barriers means I'm hyper curious about how to figure out how we change the status quo. It made me have to be an advocate for myself because other people weren't, and it made me lend that advocacy to other people. And lastly, all of this has made me super resilient and adaptive. I've been quick to find my people who recharge me. So I guess one thing I'll leave you with is how do we make sure going into lunch after this that you're building up that community of recharges as well. Charlie, over to you.
So I love that you mentioned community, because obviously we've got Cannes, and there's lots of other different communities as well that you can join, and I think the whole point of it is to make sure that you don't feel alone. And I like the fact that you talked about authenticity as well, because